Geeks and geekettes, gats and gittens, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, comic book fans from all over the world. This is once again an episode of Ask Chuck Dixon, where you get to ask me, Chuck Dixon, in person, about what I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. Although this week I'm going to put on my comic book historian hat. It's a fine felt top hat, for those wondering. And for what I'm calling my Golden Age Extra. I'm going to lay some knowledge on you this week. I get a lot of questions from people, as a world-renowned comic book raconteur. Questions from, the common folk, the hoi polloi, about the different ages of comics. What is the Golden Age? What is the Silver Age? When did one start and the other one end? Blah, blah, blah. And these questions kind of surprised me because when I got into comics, I wanted to know everything about comics. I wanted to know where they began. I wanted to know what was the first comic book. Who were the earliest pioneers in the medium that I love so much? But, not everybody's a dyed-in-the-wool freak like me. It's got to know everything about it. You read comics and you're a comic fan, but your whole life isn't about comics. And for much of my life has been just all about comic books. So I had to know everything. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an information dump on you here, my own pinhead, off-the-cuff history of the Golden Age of comics. And it'll be free of dates and a lot of names, and there won't be a lot to remember. I'm just giving you an overview of what the Golden Age comics was, where it began, where it ended, why it ended. And then in future episodes, I will go on to the Silver and Bronze Age and Copper Age, and whatever ages there are, I'll go on and explain them too. But I thought the Golden Age really needed an episode all of its own to talk about in depth. Tell you some stuff maybe you've never heard before. Maybe you'll take a brand new look at the dawn of comics. Or maybe you'll just go, check, you're full of crap. You got everything wrong. Okay, so back in the day, there were the pulps. Before the comics, there were the pulp magazines. We know the famous characters like the Shadow and the Spider and Operator 5. Tarzan started out in pulp magazines. And these things sold terrific all through the 30s, but sales began to wane. And since many of these publishers, the big publishers, owned their own printing presses, when sales began to wane, that meant idle presses. The printing presses weren't running. And when the printing presses weren't running, that meant they were losing money. So they had to get something to throw on those presses and push out to the public that was different than the pulps. And they were searching around, trying to figure out what to do, crossword puzzle books, whatever. And somebody got the brilliant idea of reprinting newspaper comic strips and printing them in magazine form or book form and putting them out there on the newsstand. Let's see what happens. And much to their surprise, they were stunned by enormous sales for these things. These things just blew up. Everybody wanted these comic strip reprints. I assume primarily children. And so like always, it's the history of comics. They just put stuff out there and they're surprised if it's a success, or more often surprised when it's not, especially in recent years. But they were going to capitalize on this. And of course, the syndicates weren't giving this stuff away for free. So the comic companies, these new comic book companies, these new publishers decided they better start creating stuff on their own. And so they were out there gathering up talent, basically wannabe newspaper strip artists, because that's where the money was. The early comic book artists, for the most part, didn't want to draw comic books. They wanted to be magazine illustrators or newspaper strip or cartoonists or editorial cartoonists, something that actually paid real money, but they either weren't talented enough or hadn't gotten the breaks, or they were young. A lot of these guys early on in comics were very young. An awful lot of guys were teenagers drawing these things. Joe Kubert was 11 and getting paid to draw comics. So this is where the Golden Age begins, and all these heroes, these tons and tons of heroes, and lots of publishers get involved. And And it all begins with Superman. Superman starts the superhero craze. He appears in Action Comics, and the publishers, national periodical publications, are stunned when there are simply no returns on this comic that features the first appearance of Superman. No, that's how periodicals work. You put them out in the newsstand. The ones that don't sell get returned to the printer. The retailer gets a credit for the returns. Well, there weren't any returns. Superman's first appearance was not showing up in the warehouse. And of course, that made them realize this thing sold through. This thing sold like a house of fire. This is a huge success. We got to do more Superman. And of course, they follow that, up with Batman. Also an enormous success, huge seller. And we're talking huge. We're talking millions of copies here, folks. We're talking lots of comics. We're talking big money. Even though they sold for a dime, you add it up in the aggregate, you're talking some real cash. And of course, other companies jumped in. Other publishers who were publishing pulps and magazines at the time thought, hey, look what those guys are doing. Let's jump in and do some of that ourselves. And after a while, there's a whole bunch of brand new superheroes. Now, most of them are crap, quite frankly, because they're produced by amateurs, they're produced by kids. Largely, they're written by guys who would rather be writing, pulps or paperback novels or writing for the newspapers. But instead, they're writing comics because, it's a paycheck. They're going to give me a page rate. Yeah, I'll write some comic books for you. God knows what the page rates were. I wouldn't be surprised if they're paying $1 a page for scripts. And of course, back in the late 30s, early 40s, if you were prolific enough, you could live on that, even in New York City. So most of them are crap. This one isn't. Captain Marvel, I think, is pretty strong throughout his run, extraordinarily popular, and a good comic throughout. C.C. Beck, Otto Binder writing. There's some really fun stuff here. Captain Marvel was a sales leader for a reason. There was a real charm to these stories. And they were created by guys who were, they wanted to be science fiction and were science fiction writers, but they wanted to be primarily known for their prose work, but they didn't phone in the comics. These comics are fun, engaging, suspenseful, funny. If you ever get to check out any early Captain Marvel, particularly into the early 50s, it really hits its stride in the early 50s with some fun stories. Kurt Schaffenberger on art. I mean, just top quality stuff. There a few other highlights of the Golden Age are Black Cat by Lee Elias. It's a really, really fun, consistently excellent adventure strip featuring a chick who's a Hollywood stunt woman who moonlights as a crime fighter. And as ludicrous as that sounds, it's even more fun when you read it. I mean, Lee Elias just leans into the craziness of it, and it's just a blast. Engaging mysteries, fun characters, great suspense situations, and of course, Lee Elias's gorgeous artwork. Plastic Man, another huge highlight, possibly the best Golden Age character ever created under the auspices of Jack Cole. Jack Cole was a genius. He did quite a number of Golden Age characters that are memorable, but the best of the lot, by far, is Plastic Man. These are just fun stories, endlessly inventive, just crazy, absurd. He creates his own reality for this series of comic stories, and they're uniformly excellent. Even when he left the book, Quality Comics managed to, for a while, maintain the quality of the stories, the level of entertainment and absurdity that Cole put into them. But Cole's stories are still the best, even though any issue of Plastic Man from Quality is a fun read. Another one was in the early 50s. Well, Submariner stories from Marvel are fun, even the Golden Age ones. They're just wacky. Bill Everett writing and drawing, and apparently sometimes Mickey Spillane writing. They're just fun. My favorite era of Submariner, though, is when they tried to reboot him, bring him back in the very early 50s as basically a comic killing machine. and again by Everett. And these stories are, to me, a lot of fun, and a few of them are actually pretty creepy. There's like a horror element to some of them. It's a little disturbing, uh, but good stuff, quality stuff. And of course, my boy Airboy. Airboy was uneven in its quality, but there's some great issues, some great stories, and fantastic artwork. Um, guys like Fred Kita, Leonard Starr, some really top talent worked on Airboy, and Airboy was a big seller for its publisher, Hillman. And, that's the thing, these things sold to kids, and they were huge. And even though the quality was inconsistent, kids found characters they loved and followed. And like I said, the sales for these things were in the millions. The millions. It's not unusual. Individual comic books to sell 1 million a month. And I'll get more into how the medium evolved right after this. Have you subscribed? Thank you. If you haven't, it's a big help to this channel. So just hit that button down there below. It won't cost you a dime. And let's get on with this. Well, now we get to Carl Barks. Now, like I said, most of the comic books are created by teenagers. They're written by guys who really don't want to be writing comic books, really don't give a crap about comic books, and nobody's really thinking about the medium. They're thinking about them like newspaper strips. Like, it's just a newspaper strip formatted in a different way. It's not until Carl Barks comes along, former Disney animator, and he takes up the assignment to create comic book stories for Dell Publishing. And he really thinks about the comic book medium. I mean, he realizes this isn't comic strips. It's not like comic strips. I've got to tell a whole story. And I can tell a long form story. It doesn't have to be 8 pages or 10 pages like so many comic book stories were. I can tell longer form stories. I can tell basically a feature length movie story on these comic book pages. And he really thinks about establishment panels, page turn panels, word balloon placement, title pages, covers, all these things that we take for granted now. Barks is the first guy to really think about this, really apply himself, really take the medium seriously, take his job seriously, and create, well-crafted, earnest efforts to. He wasn't trying to lift the comic book medium up. He didn't have any lofty concerns like that. He just wanted to have fun. He wanted to bring his talents to bear on this thing and take the job seriously and have some fun along the way. And the results were mind-blowing for the comic book industry because Barks' stuff sells like crazy. And it's basically the basis for Dell Comics, which will reign supreme, will be the King Kong, the Godzilla, the most successful comic book company probably ever in the United States. And they will dominate for the 40s and 50s and early 60s. They will be huge. And everyone else will aspire to be as good as them. And here we have Barks is teaching the Dell people how to write a comic, how to create a comic. And he's teaching all these other, young guys just breaking in how to write a comic book story. Now, how successful was Dell? This blew me away. I just found this out recently. In 1959, by 1959, Dell had sold 4 billion comic books. That's billion. 4 billion comic books. That's how pervasive they were. That's how into the pop culture they were. That's how many loyal readers they had, mostly children. And they did it with, attention to consistent quality, presenting characters that the readers liked, often licensing characters that the readers already cared about, Western characters and Zorro and Flash Gordon and things like that, in addition to the Disney titles, which were enormous for them, absolutely enormous. And so Dell will reign supreme, and we'll get back to a little bit more Dell down the line. And Dell was a publisher that owned their own presses. They published paperback books, they published crossword books, they published all kinds of things, but they were the king of the comics. Now, in World War II, something comes along called the paper drives. And this explains comic book scarcity. Why aren't there more golden? If these things sold in the millions, why do they go for millions at auction? Why are they so scarce? And it was the World War II paper drives. Kids went around the neighborhood in their little red radio flyer wagons, and they collected newspapers and comic books and magazines and everything else and turned it in for the war effort. And they were collecting tin cans, glass, anything that could be used. Today we call it recycling. Back then they called them drives. And kids enthusiastically did this. Now, the secret is they got paid. They got paid by the pound. The more paper that you collected, the more money you could make. So these kids would get a little, pocket change. I know this personally because early 60s when I was a kid, we went around collecting paper. My dad had a friend who was a junk man. And he would always tell my dad when the paper price was up. And we'd go out with our little radio flyer wagons and we would collect newspapers and turn them in. And that's how I made a lot of comic book money. So I know what these kids were going through. But because of this, an awful lot of comics got pulped to make, whatever for the war effort. And so millions and millions and millions and millions of soon-to-be valuable comic books just simply, vanished. Turned into something. Turned into maps for George Patton. I don't know what they turned the paper into, but they needed a lot of paper. They needed a lot of everything to defeat Hitler and Tojo. And comic books paid the price. So, and speaking of the war effort, comic books were a big thing with the GIs serving in Europe, serving the Pacific, and continued to be big sellers. My sister-in-law worked at a PX in Okinawa in the 60s, and she said that on comic book day, when the comic books would come in, the line would be out the door at the PX. The GIs wanting comics. Because they were portable, cheap, light, and people, again, just as the paper drives, people were collecting things to send to the GIs. And there were all kinds of reading drives. People would, send books and whatever. I mean, they would tear the covers off of hardcover books and ship them so they were lighter, so that our guys in the field would have something to read, a little taste of home, along with that Coca-Cola that Coca-Cola was sending along, and the Lucky Strike cigarettes and all the other things that they were trying to promote. And little clumsy segue here. These two guys served in World War II, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, and they had made quite a splash at Marvel with a character called Captain America. And they moved over to DC Comics because DC Comics was paying a higher page rate. They got wooed away to DC Comics. But both of them got drafted. Although I think Jack might have enlisted. I'm not. I think Joe served on the home front, but Jack was in the thick of it. Jack was at the Battle of the Bulge. Jack was the real deal. But they go over to DC Comics and they create the Boy Commandos and the Newsboy Legion, and these are hugely successful, even though they're backup. I think they were backups in like Star Spangled and Detective and things like that. They weren't even a lead feature, but they proved enormously successful, and sales of those books went up. And while the boys were away, DC had other creators working on these titles. So Boy Commandos and Newsboy Legion continue, even though Jack and Joe are in uniform. And when Jack and Joe get back, a funny thing happens. DC wants to keep them, because of the success of these two titles. So they bring Jack and Joe to lunch, probably the first lunch ever hosted for a freelancer by an editor. Soon to be a comic book tradition. They sit them down and they say, boys, we want you to stay here at National Periodicals. And here's a check. It's royalties based on the sales of Newsboy Legion and Boy Commandos. Now, I don't know what the amount on the check was, but apparently it was substantial. And Jack and Joe were kind of surprised. They weren't expecting this. Like, wow, wow, yeah, this is great. And they said, yeah, we want you to stay here at National Periodical, DC Comics, and continue creating all your great stuff just for us exclusively. So, and Jack and Joe said, yeah, that's fantastic. And Jack and Joe leave the lunch. Now, I should do an aside here. Famously, famously, Joe Simon told the story, and Jack Kirby never denied it. They're at lunch. Like I said, this is off the cuff. They're at lunch for the first time. Jack had never been in a restaurant in his life. This was a guy from Brooklyn. You know, he ate all his meals at his mama's table. Never been to a restaurant. Maybe bought a hot dog off a cart once or twice. So he's sitting there, and there are, the editors from DC are yapping on, and Jack turns to Joe and says, "What do we do here?" And Joe says, "Well, you order off the menu." And he says, "What do you mean order off the menu?" And he goes, "Well, here's the menu. You look down the menu, and you pick what you want to eat for lunch, and they're paying for it. Get whatever you want." Jack's like, "Oh, great." Jack Kirby orders 8 desserts. I love that story. So anyway, Jack and Joe leave their lunch, presumably with Jack stuffed to the rafters with pie a la mode and cheesecake, and they decide to start their own studio. They take this money and they rent office space, and they start their own comic book producing studio, because quite wisely they thought, why should we continue creating stuff for DC when we can basically open ourselves up to all different kind of publishers and make some real cash? And so what the boys do, and they're not dumb guys, man, by any means. They understand the superhero thing. It's on the wane. It's not going to last forever. Of course, the war is ending, or has ended, and so stories about the war are no longer going to sell, because it's over. The superheroes beat Hitler and Tojo, so that war is over. They got to move on to something else. So they move into different comic book genres. They move away from the superheroes, and they basically create or largely contribute to every comic book genre to pop up. They create Young Romance. Young Romance, at its height, sold 3.5 million copies every month. And it brought girls into reading comics. And girls would drive comic book sales from here to the early 70s. Yeah, we think of comic books as a boys' medium. It wasn't. For many decades, it was girls driving sales. So Young Romance is enormously popular. They create the crime genre, which became huge in the early 50s. Every publisher had a line of crime comics, but Simon and Kirby are the first ones there with it. And they create the horror comic, which, even if you only have an idol, 101 knowledge of comic books, horror comics were a big thing in the 50s, famously. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. They also do Boys Ranch, Western, and Foxhole, a war comic. And even though they didn't create these genres, they contribute to the success of them. And both Western and war comics will drive the 50s. It's romance, crime, horror, teen humor, Westerns, and war, and they drive. And the guys even did teen humor. They did a terrific character called House Date Harry, and the gag is that Harry would go ask a girl out on a date and then wangle away to simply stay home and raid the parents' refrigerator and listen to the radio rather than spend any money taking the girl out. And if you ever get to read one of them, they're pretty funny stories. So these guys were good at everything. They were good at the funny, suspense, horror, war, all the stuff. And of course, Jack Kirby, truly the king of comics. I mean, and known for his, action work. And these guys would continue on until in the early 50s, they were millionaires. They were each millionaires from 10-cent comic books. They produced so much work. Their studio was so prolific Almost everybody who worked in comics, all the comic book legends passed through their studio at one time or another. And they were just enormously successful. They really had they had their finger on the pulse of everything. And they knew what audiences wanted, how to exploit it. They understood redundant publishing. And basically, just as everyone followed Carl Barks's lead on how to create a comic, they were all following Simon and Kirby's lead through the late 40s, early 50s. And that kind of brings us to the beginning of the end for the comic book boom, the post-war comic book boom. Horror comics became all the rage. Every company had multiple horror comics. The newsstands were literally packed with them. And because, kids were eating them up, I mean, I think the horror comics appealed to even older kids. So maybe you had a teenage audience beyond the kid audience, maybe even a bunch of adults reading them. I don't know. And so, every newsstand you went to had these horror comics. And there was really no guardrails. There was no comic book code. There were no standards. They just put these things out there, grisly and gruesome and gross, and that's what the kids wanted. And of course, this leads famously to the success of EC Comics. Now, EC Comics, started up by Bill Gaines, is another advancement, sadly a brief advancement, in the medium of American comic books. Because EC Comics are, rather than just churn stuff out, now not to say that Simon and Kirby were churning stuff out, but they were certainly a machine. They were a production house. EC Comics saw itself differently. They wanted to create what today would be called artisan comics. They wanted to hire the best talent, pay them the highest page rates, encourage them to do their best work. And EC is, of course, justifiably famous for its 3 horror titles: Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, and Haunt of Fear. And these are successful. They were, for the most part, if you've ever read any of this stuff, I mean, you realize there's kind of formulaic twist ending stories, but they're done in such a way, they're crafted in such a way they're highly entertaining. They don't pander to the reader at all. Sometimes the material is challenging. Sometimes it's just silly and goofy and contrived, like comic books often are. But the entertainment value is high, and of course the artwork is unparalleled in comics at the time. It is, the best talent they can find, encouraged to do the best work. Higher page rates means more time spent on the page, and so they are just working to create the best stuff that they can. And of course, in addition to these horror comics and great science fiction comics, they also produce Mad Magazine or Mad Comic Book. Harvey Kurtzman creates Mad, and Mad is like huge seller. It's their biggest seller. It's enormous, and spawns countless imitators. And so EC's going strong. They also do what I feel are some of the best war comics ever done in the United States. Again, driven by Harvey Kurtzman, creator of Mad Magazine. And but there's trouble on the horizon. Frederick Wortham, I think a child psychologist, writes a book condemning comics as the work of perverts and greedy men out to exploit children to make cash. And he just sort of like starts this public thing. Apparently after World War II, their greatest fear of everyone in the country was the rise of juvenile delinquency. That somehow this generation of kids who were too young to go to war were going to turn into street punks. And so they were looking for, as they always do, as sociologists and psychologists and the whining class always do. They try to look for one reason, you know, one solution to the problem they created, and everybody was looking at comic books. Comic books were bloody, they were gory, they encouraged violence, they were nasty, and so they end up actually having Senate hearings because the public is so outraged. Now it's just like today with 5 or 6 people with a newsletter, or some guy with a website that 6 people visit post something, and all of a sudden, oh, it's a fervor, it's a huge, the internet is blown up. No, it really hasn't. But it appears that way. And so journalists run with this, the media runs with it, and the Senate wants to get involved because, they're whores that like to get their pictures in the paper. And so they go after the horror publishers, and they really go hammer and tong after EC. And what does EC do when they know that the lens is on them? When they know the public is looking out for nasty, horrible, bloody, gory comic books? They double down. They just stick a big middle finger in the face of the Senate, the media, and the PTA, and everybody else, and just say, hey, you can't tell us how to do comics. We're going to do comics the way we want to do them. We're just going to get really, really, really gross. And that basically results in Bill Gaines appearing before the Senate, testifying, and it doesn't go well. Mr. Gaines does not make a very good appearance in front of the Senate. He obviously got stage fright or flustered. I mean, who can blame him? All this attention, all these cameras going off as he's speaking. And he really makes a hash of it and makes things worse for all concerned. And what comes next is, of course, the Comics Code. All the comic book companies, terrified of the government coming down on them and trying to control them, much like the FCC controls broadcasting, they were like, oh man, we got to do something. So we're going to swear on our mother's graves, we're never going to make those horrible horror comics again. No more of those crime comics. You're never going to read another issue where a woman gets a syringe jabbed into her face. We're going to be good from now on. We're going to govern ourselves to keep you off our backs. And the end result is that EC simply stops publishing comics. They try a little bit in what they call new trend comics. They try to tone it down a little, and they try to do a series of illustrated stories. It doesn't work for them. The luster is gone. The magic is gone. The kids really, really wanted those gross horror comics, and now they don't have them anymore. And so EC stops publishing, and they turn Mad into a magazine, and they move on from there. And all the other publishers, Harvey and Archie, who all are like, tisk, tisk, you should be ashamed of yourself, EC, who all these publishers were publishing exactly the same kind of crap. Not crap, but, exactly the same kind of exploitative, bloody, gory stories as EC, but now all of a sudden they're the champions of goodness and light. And they're going to, it's like, we never did any of that. Yeah, you did all of that. But now they're going to be squeaky clean, all for the family. All of those companies did it. They were all playing a part in this, except Dell. Dell never plumbed the depths that EC, Atlas, MLJ, Harvey, and the rest did. I gotta say DC Comics didn't either. DC Comics did not publish any horror comics. They did not publish any crime comics. But Dell still is the champion. And because of this, Dell does not become part of the comic book code authority. They come up with their own pledge to parents. Each comic for a few months had a whole page with a pledge to parents that Dell comics are wholesome comics, that there'll never be anything in there that isn't appropriate for children. And this basically allows them to survive this debacle, because trust me, when the Comics Code comes along, sales go down. They go down dramatically. And so Dell continues on. They continue their reign. And of course, they're printing themselves. They're distributing themselves. And when I was a kid, I think throughout the 50s, and then when I was a kid, there were stores where the only comics were Dell comics, and they had special racks just like this. Upscale pharmacies and stuff like that only carried Dell. They didn't carry any other comic books. So Dell continues on strong, still selling in the millions, while the other companies are flagging and falling apart. And of course, I don't know why that's up there. It doesn't help that the companies are at each other's throats trying to survive. Fawcett Publications, who published Captain Marvel, are continually plagued by lawsuits from DC saying that Captain Marvel is a ripoff of Superman, which it really isn't. But they keep saying that it is. And the end result is that Fawcett finally just, with sales going down, with the Comics Code being pushed onto them, Fawcett just says, "Out of hell with it. We're getting out of this business. We're not going to publish comic. We're going to go back to doing crossword puzzle books and paperbacks, and we're going to get out of comics entirely." And they just sort of make a deal with DC that DC gets the rights to Captain Marvel, rights that DC immediately squanders by just not doing anything, not renewing trademark, so they lose the name Captain Marvel, not publishing, not continuing the Captain Marvel comics, because they saw them as direct competition for Superman, which they probably were, but it was fair competition. And you can argue all day long which one came first and was one a copy of another, but I don't think Captain Marvel was a copy of Superman at all. He was just another superpowered guy who can fly. And there the differences end. There's no similarity at all between Captain Marvel and Superman. But, Fawcett got tired of the lawsuits. Other companies went out of business at the same time for the same reason. Hillman Publishing, who published Airboy and a number of other comics, simply said, "Yeah, we don't want to do this anymore. If we have to do this Comics Code thing and all the rest of it, we're just going to get out of it." And they went back to publishing whatever it is they were publishing. Quality Comics as well simply stopped publication, and I say some sort of deal with DC Comics for a lot of their recurring characters like Blackhawks and Plastic Man and things like that. So DC Comics got the rights to them and largely squandered them as well. But DC was into growing its market share and simply either forcing these other companies out of business or making deals that made them going out of business seem attractive, increased DC's market share because they were reducing competition. And DC would continue, they jump right in on that old Comics Code and continue publishing comics. Yes, they had Superman and Batman, and they had Wonder Woman, but I believe Wonder Woman was at a bi-monthly through most of the 50s. But they had Superman and Batman. They were leading, but they also had big selling titles in all the other genres, from humor to war to western to funny animal, and they did well, and they had their own distribution chain, so they managed to survive. And of course, Archie survived everything. Archie was bulletproof. Even though Archie Comics, MLJ, had gotten into the horror thing and gotten into some particularly violent superhero comics, they still had the squeaky clean image of their flagship character, Archie. And so they survived this debacle caused by the Senate hearings and the Comics Code. Although, I mean, the stink of Wortham and the do-gooders and the PTA and the rest would follow comics throughout the decade into the next, where comics were persona non grata. They were banned at schools. They were looked down upon as trash. This would continue for a long time, the effects of that. Marvel in the 50s copies DC after an aborted attempt to bring the superheroes back, which doesn't sell very well. They move into sci-fi, what we would call mystery comics, that kind of replaced horror comics, war stuff, and comics for girls like Patsy and Hetty and Millie the Model and stuff like that. And of course, Harvey would abandon its horror line and lean hard into its juvenile characters. producing lots and lots of titles over the years, and trying to keep their image all cleaned up, trying to retcon their own image. Through this period, there's really only a few highlights, and for me, the biggest one is the arrival of John Stanley. John Stanley takes on Little Lulu, which was based on a Saturday Evening Post cartoon, and he and his group of merry creators create an American comic book classic. And he goes on to create other stuff. He had worked in the funny animal trenches for quite a while before taking on Little Lulu, and but this became an enormous seller, millions of copies a month. Marge, who created, I can't remember her last name, maybe Marge is her last name, who created Little Lulu, would routinely get royalty checks of $50,000 a year just based on sales of the comic book. And $50,000 in 1950s money, that was big money. That was a lot more than a surgeon was making back in the 50s every year. And eventually she would sell Little Lulu for what I believe is an undisclosed amount to Dell Comics. And Dell, eagerly paid, wrote a check to get the rights to Little Lulu because the comic books were so enormously successful with spin-off comics featuring Tubby and seasonal specials and annuals and everything else. John Stanley and his crew pumped out an awful lot of Little Lulu work, and the success of it is deserved. It's a well-written, well-crafted, funny, endearing comic with a charm all its own. I mean, Little Lulu is unique amongst the many, many juvenile characters featured in comics in the period, in that the stories read just as entertaining, just as funny, and just as well done today as they did back then. Those lucky kids, they were getting some decent comics back then. So this is how the golden age kind of moves along into the 50s, sort of, trundles along. Some companies limping, some going out of business, characters and franchises rising and falling, genres coming and going. And it all ends with the arrival of this guy and the dawn of the Silver Age of comics, which I will visit in a future episode and tell you a whole bunch of stuff you might have not known about the Silver Age of comics. Hey, if you have a suggestion, a question, or whatever, picture your cats, your kitties, your doggies, send it to brunobookstore at gmail.com, brunobookstore at gmail.com. You can ask questions down here below in the comments under the video. That's fine, but sometimes I miss them. You can ask questions on Facebook. Sometimes I miss them. I never miss a question on brunobookstore at gmail.com. If you send a question to brunobookstore at gmail.com and I don't answer it, I'll tell you why I'm not answering that question. Because some of you ask some pretty incendiary questions, things I don't want to get into. Hey, have you been reading My Sister Suprema? If not, why not? To give it a shot, okay? And that's it for me this week. Hope you enjoyed this little slice of four-color history, and I will see all of you down the road.